Hello and welcome to my channel. Close your eyes, lean back, immerse yourself in the story, and get ready to drift off to sleep in peace. Relax, subscribe, and leave a comment. For most of history, night was not a pause between 2 days. It was a world of its own, with its own laws, its own dangers, and its own quiet freedoms. When the sun dropped behind the walls of a medieval town, most written history simply stopped. The chroniclers put down their pens, the court records fell silent, and the great halls emptied of their scribes. But life did not stop, it changed shape. In that changed world, women moved differently than they did by day. The rules that governed a woman's body, her voice, and her movement during daylight hours were, after dark, tested, bent, and sometimes broken entirely. A woman who spent her afternoons spinning wool under the watchful eye of a husband or a guild inspector might spend her evening trading whispered advice with a neighbor about a difficult pregnancy, or slipping through a side gate to meet someone she was never meant to meet at all. This is not a story of costumes and castles. It is a story of candle stubs and cooling hearths, of midwives roused from sleep by a frightened knock, of nuns rising before the birds to chant psalms no one but God would hear, of alewives pouring the last cup before curfew, and of ordinary women finding, in the hours between dusk and dawn, version of themselves that daylight rarely allowed. Historians have long focused on what medieval women did while the sun was up. Their labor in the fields, their duties in the home, their presence, or more often their absence, in the official record. But surviving court documents, guild ordinances, church penitentials, and the rare surviving diary reveal a second life. One lived largely in shadow. Curfew bells, called the couvre-feu in France, from which the English word curfew descends, rang out each evening to order households to cover their fires and retreat indoors. Yet the very existence of laws punishing women for being outside after dark tells us something important. They often were. Across the villages of rural England, the crowded streets of Florence, the trading quarters of Bruges, and the convents of the Rhineland, the medieval night held an entire hidden architecture of female labor, faith, fear, and quiet rebellion. Over the chapters that follow, we will step behind the closing gates and drawn shutters of medieval Europe, roughly from the 11th through the 15th centuries, to understand how women of every rank, from the highest noblewoman to the poorest peasant, actually lived once the light was gone. This is a journey into candlelit kitchens and moonlit fields, into convent chapels and tavern doorways, into the small, unrecorded moments that made up half of every medieval woman's life. The sun has set. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The bells that closed the world. In most medieval towns, the night began with a sound. A bell from a parish church or a town hall tower marked the moment when the working day legally ended and a different, more carefully watched day began. This bell, and the practice behind it, gave English its word curfew, borrowed from the old French couvre-feu, meaning literally cover the fire. Its original purpose was practical rather than moral. Wooden buildings, packed tightly along narrow streets, were a constant fire risk, and a household hearth left burning through the night could destroy an entire quarter of a city before dawn. So at the ringing of the bell, families were expected to bank their coals, extinguish open flames, and shutter their windows. But curfew quickly became about more than fire safety. Town councils across England, France, and the Low Countries used the hours after bell to regulate who could be seen in public, and women were watched especially closely. In many town charters and guild records, a woman found on the street after curfew without a male escort or a clearly legitimate reason could be questioned by the watch, or in some cases detained until morning. The underlying assumption, recorded plainly in surviving municipal statutes, was that a respectable woman had no reason to be outside once darkness fell. A woman out at night was, by the logic of the time, either working in a trade the authorities tolerated but did not fully approve of, or she was doing something she should not have been doing at all. Yet the same records that reveal these restrictions also reveal again and again that women broke them. Court rolls from towns such as York and Nottingham list women fined for being abroad after the bell, often on ordinary, unremarkable errands, fetching a midwife, carrying food to a sick relative, or walking home from a late shift of washing or brewing. The law assumed a woman's place was indoors after dark. The reality of medieval labor, illness, and family life made that assumption impossible to keep. Night watchmen, usually men appointed by the town or hired by wealthier households, patrolled the streets carrying lanterns and staves, calling out the hour and watching for fires, thieves, and curfew breakers alike. Their presence created a strange partnership with the women who moved through the dark. Watchmen might turn a blind eye to a known local midwife hurrying to a birth, recognizing her basket and her purpose, while treating an unfamiliar woman with her suspicion. Reputation, built up over years of visible daylight behavior, became a kind of currency that could be spent after dark, buying a woman the benefit of the doubt from the men who controlled the streets at night. For the wealthy, curfew meant something different entirely. A noble household did not need to fear the town watch in the same way. Its own walls, its own guards, and its own private access to the streets placed it partly outside the reach of municipal law. For a servant or a tradeswoman, however, the closing gates of a walled town could mean the difference between reaching home safely and being locked outside until morning. exposed to whatever dangers the dark streets held. In cities that still maintained Roman or early medieval walls, the gates themselves were physically shut and barred each night, watched over by guards who kept careful account of who passed through in the final hours before closing. The sound of that bell, then, was not merely a signal to sleep. It was the moment each day when medieval society drew its clearest line between the world it wished to control and the world it could not fully see. Everything that follows in this story happened on the far side of that line, in the hours the law tried, and largely failed, to govern. Chapter 2. Threads in dark, spinning and end, weaving being candlelit. Long after the fields had gone quiet and the animals had been settled for the night, one sound continued in nearly every medieval household. The soft, rhythmic whir of a spindle turning wool into thread. Spinning was so closely tied to women's labor that the word itself gave English terms the term spinster, originally meaning simply a woman who spins, later coming to describe an unmarried woman. Since spinning was often the trade that supported women who had no husband to provide for them. Unlike field work or brewing, spinning required little light and could be done almost entirely by feel. A skilled spinner could draw wool into even thread with her eyes half closed, guided by touch rather than sight. This made it, in a very, very literal sense, the ideal night labor. Household accounts and guild records from towns such as Coventry and Ghent described women spinning by the light of a single tallow candle or the last glow of the hearth, producing thread that would later be sold, woven or used to clothe the family. In many households, this evening spinning was not extra work layered onto an already full day. It was the primary source of a woman's independent income, money that belonged to her in a way that field wages or household duties often did not. The distaff, the tool that held a raw wool or flax during spinning, became so associated with women's work that it entered the language as a symbol of the entire female side of a family, giving rise to the Old English phrase, the distaff side, to describe a person's maternal relatives. Weaving, by contrast, usually required more light and a fixed loom, and so tended to happen earlier in the evening, in the last hour before full darkness, or in workshops lit by multiple candles for those who could afford the expense. Textile guilds in cities such as Florence and Bruges depended heavily on this evening and night labor, even as formal guild membership was often closed to women. Wives and daughters of registered male weavers frequently did the actual spinning, carding, and preparatory work late into the night. Their names absent from the official rolls, even as their labor sustained the family's place within the trade. Surviving wage records occasionally list payments made directly to women for spinning completed after dark, suggesting that despite their exclusion from formal guild recognition, their night work was a night work was economically indispensable and, at times, explicitly compensated. For poorer women working alone, an evening's spinning might mean the difference between having bread the next day and going without. A widow with no land and no trade guild to support her could still, with wool supplied on credit by a local merchant, spin through the night and sell her thread the following morning, decide day after day. This kind of piecework, done in the flickering light of a single flame, represents one of the clearest examples of how the medieval night was not empty time, but working time, quietly essential to the economy of the household, and, by extension, to the town itself. Chapter 3. Keepers of beherberg, poking in and having and serving after dark. While spinning filled the quiet hours of the evening, other tasks demanded the last heat of a dying fire before it was banked for the night. Bread dough, for instance, often needed to rise overnight, and a woman would knead and set her loaves by firelight, so they would be ready for the communal or household oven. In towns where houses shared a single baking oven, women sometimes negotiated turns for its use late into the evening, timing their work around neighbors doing the same. Brewing, too, was overwhelmingly women's work throughout much of medieval Europe, and much of it happened after the day's other labor was finished. The yellow wife, as she was commonly known, brewed ale from malted grain, a process that required careful attention to timing and temperature, often best managed in the cooler, calmer hours of evening. Because ale spoiled quickly and could not be stored for long periods, brewing was a frequent, almost weekly task in many households, and a skilled alewife could earn real income selling her surplus to neighbors, marking her house with a distinctive pole or bush hung outside to advertise fresh ale for sale. Preserving food for the winter months also frequently spilled into the evening hours, particularly during the autumn slaughtering season, when meat had to be salted, smoked, or otherwise prepared before it spoiled. Women worked by firelight to render fat, pack meat into barrels, and hang herbs to dry from the rafters, racing against time in a period before refrigeration, when a single day's delay could mean the loss of food meant to last an entire household through winter. Court and manorial records occasionally capture glimpses of this nocturnal domestic labor when something went wrong. Coroner's rolls from English villages record accidental deaths of women who fell into hearth fires late at night while tending pots or ovens, exhausted from a long day that had not yet ended, even as darkness fell outside. These grim records, unintentionally, provide some of the clearest evidence we have that a woman's working day in a medieval household routinely extended well past sunset, governed not by the clock, but by demands of dough that needed to rise, ale that needed to ferment, and food that needed to be saved before it spoiled. The hearth itself, banked each night under the ashes to keep a coal alive until morning, was almost always a woman's responsibility to manage. Letting the fire go out entirely meant the difficult, sometimes costly task of relighting it from a neighbor's coals, or with flint and steel, so the nightly ritual of carefully covering the embers, the very act that gave curfew its name, was in most households performed by the woman of the house as the last task of her long day. Chapter 4. Hence, Dakart, die newborn, midwives, and naked healers. No figure moved through the medieval night with more authority or more urgency than the midwife. Childbirth followed no schedule, and a midwife might be roused from sleep at any hour by a frantic knock at her door, summoned to a neighboring house or a distant farm to attend a woman in labor. Unlike almost any other female figure in medieval society, a midwife's right to move freely after curfew was widely, if informally, recognized. Town ordinances that otherwise restricted women's movement after dark frequently made explicit exceptions for midwives traveling to attend a birth, acknowledging that this was work which could not wait for morning. The midwife's night bag, often containing herbs, oils, and simple instruments passed down through years of practice, represented a body of practical medical knowledge, held almost entirely by women, and transmitted orally from one generation to the next. Church records occasionally required midwives to be licensed or approved by local clergy, particularly because a midwife might need to perform an emergency baptism on a dying infant, a responsibility normally reserved for a priest, but permitted to a midwife when time did not allow for one to be summoned. This gave the midwife a unique, semi-official status that placed her, however briefly, above the ordinary restrictions placed on women's movement and authority. Beyond childbirth, women skilled in herbal medicine were frequently the first, and sometimes the only, source of care available during a nighttime illness or injury. A wise woman or healer, terms used loosely and inconsistently across different regions and periods, might be called upon in the deep hours of the night to treat a fever, set a broken bone, or ease the pain of the dying. Surviving herbals and household remedy books, some compiled by literate noblewomen and passed among female relatives, catalog treatments for exactly these kinds of urgent nighttime needs, from fever-reducing infusions to poultices for wounds. This nocturnal medical role placed women in a position of genuine, if often unacknowledged, power. A midwife or healer summoned in the middle of the night held, in that moment, more practical authority over life and death than almost anyone else present, including the husband or father of the household. Yet this same power made these women vulnerable. The very knowledge that made a midwife indispensable during a difficult birth could, if that birth ended badly, become the basis for suspicion, gossip, or in rarer and more serious cases, accusations of witchcraft, a danger we will return to later in this story. For now, it is enough to understand that the medieval knight depended on these women, and that their willingness to leave a warm bed and walk dark streets or country paths at any hour was one of the quiet, essential supports holding medieval communities together. Chapter 5. Prayer Suites. Nurse Suites. Nuns' vigils and sacred darkness. For one significant group of medieval women, the night was not a break from structured life, but its most rigorously scheduled part. Nuns living under monastic rule organized their entire day and night around a fixed cycle of prayer known as the Divine Office, and several of its most important services took place in the darkest hours before dawn. Matins, the longest of these night offices, was typically sung or recited in the deep quiet of the very early morning, often beginning around 2 o'clock, requiring nuns to rise from sleep, dress in the cold, and process to a candlelit chapel, while the rest of the world lay dark and still around them. This discipline of nightly prayer was not viewed as a hardship to be minimized, but as a spiritual practice with its own particular
value. Rising in darkness to pray was understood within monastic tradition as an act of vigilance and devotion that mirrored the wakeful watchfulness expected of the faithful soul. Convent records and surviving monastic customaries describe the careful arrangements made to support this schedule, from the appointment of a nun responsible for waking the community, often using a bell or a lantern carried room, to the provision of warm clothing for the walk, to the unheated chapel. The candlelit interior of a convent chapel during matins offered one of the most visually striking scenes of the medieval night. Rows of women in dark habits, their faces is lit only by the flames of altar candles, their voices rising together in Latin chant that carry out into the surrounding darkness. For many nuns, this nightly ritual represented not deprivation, but a kind of profound intimacy with the divine, a time when the ordinary noise and obligation of daylight life fell away entirely. Beyond the great monastic houses, individual laywomen also kept their own private nocturnal devotions. Wealthier women sometimes maintained personal prayer books, known as books of hours, structured around these same monastic prayer times, allowing them to observe a version of the sacred nights within their household. Surviving books of hours commissioned by nobler women frequently include illustrations depicting women praying alone by candlelight, suggesting that this practice of private night devotion extended beyond convent walls. For anchoresses, women who chose to be enclosed permanently in a small cell attached to a church, often for life, night held a particular intensity. Guidance texts written for anchoresses, such as the well-known Anchoring Whist composed in England, include detailed instructions for night prayer, and describe the isolation and spiritual focus of those hours in vivid terms. In the silence of an anchor hold at midnight, with only a small window connecting the anchoress to the church beyond, the boundary between the ordinary world and a life devoted entirely to prayer became, for a few hours each night, almost impossible to perceive. Chapter 6: Stolen House, Couch, Love, and Secrecy. Daylight in a medieval household offered a woman almost no privacy. Pork seat, worked, ate, and slept under the constant observation of parents, husbands, employers, and neighbors, in homes where several generations often shared a single room. Darkness changed this calculation completely. The same shadows that town councils feared as cover for crime also offered ordinary people, and young women in particular, one of their only opportunities for an unsupervised conversation, a private word, or a stolen moment with someone they were not permitted to see openly. Court records dealing with matters of morality, kept by both secular and church authorities, provide surprisingly detailed evidence of this. Depositions taken in disputes over broken marriage promises frequently describe meetings that took place at night, at a garden wall, a barn, or a quiet lane just beyond the edge of a village, precisely because such locations offered privacy that no daylight setting could. A young woman might arrange, through a trusted servant, or a sibling acting as messenger, to meet a suitor after her household had gone to sleep, returning before anyone noticed her absence. Such meetings carried real risk. A woman's reputation, and by extension her family's honor, and her own future marriage prospects, depended heavily on being seen as chaste and properly supervised. Being discovered in a nighttime meeting with a man, even an entirely innocent one, could permanently damage a young woman's standing in her community. Church court records from across medieval Europe include numerous cases of women defending themselves against accusations of impropriety stemming from exactly this kind of nocturnal encounter, insisting that a meeting had been chaperoned or entirely misunderstood. Yet the same records reveal that many women judged the risk worth taking. For couples whose families opposed a match, for those separated by class or by feuding families, or simply for those who wished a few private moments before a formally arranged marriage, the night offered the only available space. Some regions developed customary practices that gave this kind of courtship a degree of social recognition, allowing young people from neighboring households to gather informally after the day's work, under looser supervision than daylight hours would permit, provided certain unspoken boundaries were respected. Marriage itself in the medieval period was,
For most women, less a matter of romantic choice than of family strategy, land, an alliance. It is precisely because daylight offered so little room for personal feeling that nighttime meetings carried such weight. Brief conversation at a well after dark, a note passed by a servant, or a song sung quietly beneath a window represented, for many medieval women, one of the only chances to exercise any personal choice at all in a matter that would otherwise be decided entirely by others. The secrecy required was not incidental to these encounters. It was, in a very real sense, what made them possible. Chapter 7: Wise Woman and the Fairer of the Night. The same knowledge of herbs, remedies, and the body that made a woman valuable as a healer or midwife could, under the wrong circumstances, become dangerous to her. Medieval communities generally held deeply ambivalent feelings about women who possessed unusual skill or knowledge, particularly knowledge connected to birth, death, and the natural world, all of which were closely associated with the hours of darkness. It is important to state clearly what the surviving historical evidence actually shows. Large-scale witch hunts and trials, the events most commonly associated in popular imagination with medieval witchcraft, were overwhelmingly a phenomenon of the early modern period. From the late 15th century onward, and peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries, after the medieval period as historians, it had ended. During the Central and later Middle Ages themselves, accusations of maleficent magic did occur, and church authorities took such concerns seriously, but formal prosecutions were considerably less frequent and less systematic than the later witch hunts that followed. That said, suspicion toward women who worked alone and at night, who possessed specialized herbal knowledge, or who lived outside the ordinary structure of a household headed by a man, did exist throughout the medieval period. An elderly widow living alone at the edge of a village, gathering plants by moonlight for remedies she had practiced for decades, occupied a socially precarious position. If a neighbor's cattle sickened, or a child died unexpectedly, or a birth she had attended ended in tragedy, such a woman could become an object of gossip. Blame, or in more serious cases, formal accusation before a local or church court. Church penitentials and pastoral manuals from the period reveal that clergy were far more concerned in practice with what they termed superstitious folk practices, small charms, protective rituals, and traditional remedies, mixing Christian prayer with older customs than with organized witchcraft. In the later sense, priests were instructed to discourage parishioners, women especially, from practices such as leaving offerings at wells or trees, reciting charms over the sick, or performing small protective rituals at night meant to guard a household from harm. These were treated as matters requiring correction and and penance rather than capital crimes, reflecting a medieval church more focused on guiding behavior than on the large-scale prosecution that would characterize later centuries. The night itself carried deep symbolic weight in medieval thought, frequently associated in sermons and popular belief with spiritual danger, temptation, and the presence of forces hostile to the ordinary order. A woman moving through that symbolic darkness, especially one already marked by age, poverty, or an unusual degree of independence, occupied genuinely uncertain ground. Her knowledge might save a neighbor's child 1 week, and, if fortune turned, be used to condemn her the next. This precariousness, more than any organized persecution, defined the real texture of medieval fear surrounding wise women and the night. 8. Alley, markets, and the woman walked the dark streets. As curfew fell and most households retreated behind shuttered windows, a smaller number of women remained visible in the streets, tending to trades that could not simply stop when the light failed. Alewives, as already noted, brewed and sold ale from their own homes, and the final hours before curfew were often their busiest, as laborers, travelers, and neighbors gathered for a last cup before the bell rang and the town settled for the night. Taverns and alehouses occupied an uneasy place in medieval urban life, simultaneously essential to the local economy and social fabric, and viewed with suspicion by authorities concerned about drunkenness, disorder, and the mixing of unrelated men and women after dark. Women who ran these establishments, whether as widows continuing a late husband's trade, or as independent tradeswomen in their own right, had to navigate constant scrutiny. Municipal ordinances in towns across England and the Low Countries regulated tavern hours tightly, often requiring establishments to close or shortly after curfew, and alewives found serving past the permitted hour faced fines recorded in surviving borough court rolls. Beyond the tavern, women also worked the edges of the night market, particularly in larger trading cities where goods arrived by boat or cart at irregular hours and needed immediate handling. Fishwives in coastal and river towns sometimes worked through the early night hours, preparing the day's catch for morning sail, their work governed by the rhythm of tides and boats rather than the setting sun. In cities such as London and Paris, women also engaged in small-scale trading and hawking that continued into the evening hours, selling food, candles, or household goods to those still moving through the streets. This visible presence in the nighttime economy placed working women in a genuinely contradictory position. Their labor was necessary and, in the case of successful alewives, could be quite profitable, granting a degree of financial independence rarely available to women through other means. Yet the same visibility that brought income also brought exposure to exactly the kind of moral suspicion that curfew laws were designed to enforce. A woman serving ale to a room of men after dark occupied public space in a way that ran directly against prevailing ideas about proper female behavior, even as the community depended on her to do exactly that. Some towns responded to this tension by developing specific regulations aimed at women in these trades, restricting the hours during which they could sell, requiring male oversight of certain establishments, or imposing particular fines on women found serving customers after the legal closing hour. That such detailed regulation existed at all confirms what the broader evidence already suggests. Women were a constant, necessary presence in the medieval nighttime economy. However uneasily that presence sat within the wider expectations of their society. Chapter 9 Guardians Audience of the called Omend Uol watched over the home. While official night watches in medieval towns were composed of men, a quieter, less formal system of nocturnal vigilance operated inside nearly every household, and it rested overwhelmingly on women. The mistress of a house, whether a noblewoman managing a great household, or a peasant wife overseeing a single cottage, bore responsibility for securing the home each night, barring doors, checking that fires were properly banked, accounting for children and servants, and remaining alert to any disturbance that might signal danger. In larger households, this responsibility extended considerably further. Noblewomen managing estates, particularly during a husband's frequent absences on military campaign, pilgrimage, or business, effectively ran the household's entire security and provisioning system, including its response to any nighttime threat. Surviving household accounts and letters, such as those preserved from prominent English families, reveal women making decisions about fortification, the posting of guards, and emergency preparations, responsibilities that placed them squarely in command during the vulnerable hours when an estate might be most exposed to raiders, bandits, or rival claimants to disputed land. For women managing more modest households, the nightly ritual of securing the home carried its own quiet weight. A widow living alone, or a wife whose husband worked away from home for extended periods, could not rely on a male protector to check the doors or investigate an unfamiliar sound outside. She herself became the household's first and often only line of defense, responsibility reflected in the practical items commonly found in inventories of women's households. A stout bar for the door, a knife or small blade kept within reach, and in some regions, a dog trained to raise an alarm. This role extended to caring for the sick and dying through the night as well. Long before the emergence of formal nursing as a profession, it was overwhelmingly women. Whether family members, servants, or hired watchers, who sat through the night hours at the bedside of the ill, managing fevers, administering remedies, and providing the constant attention that serious illness demanded. Wills and household records occasionally mention payment made to women specifically for nighttime care of the sick, a form of labor entirely dependent on a woman's willingness to remain awake and alert through hours when the rest of the household slept. In convents, a similar pattern of nocturnal guardianship existed. Guardianship existed in a more structured form, with certain nuns assigned specific responsibility for maintaining order and safety within the community during the night hours, checking that doors remained secured and that the rhythm of prayer and rest proceeded as it should across every level of medieval society. Then, from the grandest estate to the humblest cottage, the safety of the household through the night rested substantially on the vigilance, judgment, and physical presence of its women. Chapter 10, Candlelight and Court. Noblewoman after dark. For noblewomen, the hours after the formal business of the day concluded offered a different kind of night than that experienced by peasant or urban working women, shaped less by physical labor than by the complex demands of political life, correspondence, and household governance. Great households did not simply stop functioning when the sun set. Feasts, entertainments, diplomatic conversation, and private business often extended well into the evening, conducted by candlelight in halls and chambers at considerable expense. Letter writing frequently occupied noblewomen during these evening hours, particularly for those managing estates, negotiating marriages for their children, or maintaining the extensive networks of family and political alliance on which noble power depended. Surviving letter collections from prominent medieval men, including collections preserved from 15th century English gentry families, reveal correspondence written and dispatched at all hours, addressing matters ranging from estate management and legal disputes to marriage negotiations and requests for aid, much of it composed in the relative quiet of evening once the day's more immediate demands had eased. The evening meal itself, when held with any degree of formality, functioned as a significant social and political occasion in noble households, and the woman of the house typically bore responsibility for its organization, from the seating of guests, according to careful considerations of rank, alliance, to the management of servants, ensuring that food and entertainment proceeded smoothly. In households hosting important guests, a poorly managed evening could carry real political consequences, making the noblewoman's oversight of these hours a matter of genuine strategic importance rather than mere domestic courtesy. Music and storytelling also filled many noble evenings, with women frequently participating as both audience and performer. Some nobler women were accomplished musicians in their own right, while others maintained households that included minstrels or storytellers whose performances provided entertainment after the day's work and business had concluded. These evening gatherings, small and relatively intimate compared to the larger public occasions of daylight court life, offered nobler women one of their few opportunities for conversation and social exchange conducted on somewhat more equal terms with the men present. Private devotion also occupied nobler women's evenings, echoing in miniature the monastic patterns described earlier. Many maintained personal chapels or dedicated prayer spaces within their households, retreating there before sleep to observe private prayers, often guided by an illuminated book of hours commissioned specifically for their own use. This combination of practical governance, political correspondence, social performance, and private devotion meant that a nobler woman's evening, while materially far more comfortable than that of a peasant or urban laborer, was rarely idle, filled instead with its own particular demands that simply took a different shape once the candles were lit. Chapter 11. The Rhythm of the Rural Night. In the countryside, where the overwhelming majority of medieval Europe's population actually lived, night followed a rhythm shaped less by church bells and town curfews than by the demands of livestock, weather, and the agricultural calendar. Peasant women's evenings varied enormously depending on the season, with the long, light-filled evenings of summer allowing work to continue well past what a modern observer might consider the day's natural end, while the short, dark days of winter compressed nearly all activity into a narrow band of daylight, pushing indoor tasks such as spinning and mending deeping into the evening hours by necessity. Livestock required attention regardless of the hour, and peasant woman's night might be interrupted by the need to check on a birthing animal, secure a wandering goat, or respond to the alarm raised by dogs at the approach of a predator or an unfamiliar visitor. Manorial records occasionally document disputes and even accidents arising from these nighttime agricultural duties, offering glimpses of women moving between house and barn by lantern or moonlight, managing the practical emergencies that the rural used without regard. The rural night also carried its own particular dangers, distinct from those of the walled town. Isolated farmsteads lacked the collective protection of town walls, and an organized watch, leaving individual households more directly exposed to the risk of theft, animal predation, or, during periods of war or unrest, the threat of raiding parties. Women managing a household during a husband's absence, whether for a day's work in a distant field or a longer period away entirely, often bore direct responsibility for assessing and responding to these threats through the night, a responsibility reflected in the practical watchful habits, documented in surviving rural customs and household guidance. Seasonal agricultural labor also brought its own nighttime demands. During the harvest, when grain needed to be gathered quickly before weather could ruin it, work sometimes extended by necessity into the early evening hours, with women joining in the final stages of gathering and binding alongside men, a temporary blurring of the more rigid daily divisions of labor that prevailed during quieter parts of the agricultural year. Similarly, during lambing or calving season, women experienced in animal husbandry might spend entire nights in the barn attending births that, much like human childbirth, followed no convenient schedule. For most rural women, then, the night was not a single uniform experience, but something that shifted constantly with the season, the weather, and particular demands of the farm. Winter nights, long and dark, brought their own trials of cold and confinement, filled with indoor handwork by carefully rationed fire. Summer nights, shorter and warmer, blurred more easily into the working day. Across both, the rural woman's night remained fundamentally tied to the land and the animals in her care, a rhythm dictated by nature rather than by any bell or curfew. Dalf danger after dark, crime, fien and vulnerability. For all the labor, devotion, and quiet independence that the medieval night made possible, it also carried genuine danger, and women bore a disproportionate share of that risk. Court records from across medieval Europe document assaults, robberies, and other crimes committed against women who found themselves outside after dark. Whether through necessity, misfortune, or simple bad timing, the same darkness that offered privacy for a stolen conversation also concealed those who meant real harm, and medieval communities were acutely, if imperfectly, aware of this danger. This awareness shaped much of the legal and social restriction on women's movement after curfew discussed earlier in this account. It would be inaccurate to characterize these restrictions purely as instruments of control divorced from any genuine concern for safety. Guild leaders and families alike understood from repeated painful experience recorded in court rolls that the night streets posed real risks that daylight generally did not. Unfortunately, the practical response to this danger often fell most heavily on women themselves, restricting their movement rather than addressing the underlying threat. Domestic violence, too, frequently intensified after dark, when a household's activities moved behind closed doors and away from the more public accountability of daylight interactions with neighbors and community. Church court records dealing with marital disputes occasionally reference incidents occurring at night, when a husband's temper, often fueled by drink consumed at a tavern before curfew closed it, turned violent within the privacy of the home. The very darkness that concealed a stolen courtship from disapproving eyes could equally conceal abuse from any possibility of outside intervention. Travel after dark carried its own well-documented perils. Women traveling between towns, whether merchants, pilgrims, or those simply visiting family, faced the risk of robbery on isolated roads, a danger significant enough that many travelers deliberately tightly timed their journeys to avoid being caught outside a town's walls after the gates had closed for the night. Pilgrimage accounts and travel narratives from the period occasionally describe the careful precautions taken by women travelers, including choosing to travel in seeking larger groups, seeking lodging well before dusk, and avoiding roads known to harbor thieves. It is worth noting, however, that the picture preserved in surviving records may itself be somewhat skewed by what the legal system chose to document. Crimes against women of higher social standing generated far more paperwork and therefore far more surviving evidence than those committed against poorer women, whose experiences of nighttime danger were frequently recorded only in passing. What survives likely represents only a partial account of the genuine risks medieval women navigated once darkness fell, risks that shaped, in ways both large and small, nearly every decision a woman made about moving through her world after the sun went down. Chapter 10. Factor-led festivals and seasonal nights. Not every medieval night was governed by labor, danger, or quiet restriction. Certain nights were set aside deliberately for community celebration, and these occasions offered women a rare, socially sanctioned opportunity to gather, celebrate, and occupy public space after dark, without the suspicion that ordinarily attached to a woman abroad at night. Midsummer's Eve, celebrated around the summer solstice in late June, stands among the best documented of these occasions, marked in communities across England and continental Europe with bonfires, dancing, and communal festivity that extended well into the night. These bonfire celebrations carried both Christian and older folk associations, having become closely linked with the feast of Saint John the Baptist, while also preserving customs such as leaping over flames or gathering particular herbs believed to hold special power. Night of the year that reflected older seasonal traditions absorbed into the medieval Christian calendar. Women participated actively in these festivities, and surviving town records occasionally note the particular involvement of women in preparing the herbs, garlands, and foods associated with the celebration. And the new year brought its own cluster of nighttime festivity, including the 12 days of Christmas culminating in Epiphany, during which normal social hierarchies were sometimes temporarily loosened through customs of feasting, games. Reversal. Women in both noble and common households took active roles in organizing these celebrations, managing the elaborate preparation of food and entertainment that such occasions demanded, work that itself extended deep into the preceding evenings as households readied themselves for the festivities to come. Church vigils, held on the eve of major feast days, represented another significant category of sanctioned nighttime gathering, drawing entire Khmer communities, women very much included, to churches for services that stretched from evening into the following morning. Unlike the more purely secular bonfire celebrations, these vigils carried explicit religious sanction, making a woman's presence at church throughout the night entirely appropriate in a way that ordinary movement through the streets after curfew was not. Weddings, too, frequently included substantial evening and nighttime celebration, with feasting, music, and dancing continuing well past the hour that would ordinarily see a household's fire and its doors secured. For the span of these particular nights, the usual boundaries governing where and when women could be seen loosened considerably, replaced by a different, temporary set of expectations built around communal joy rather than individual restriction. These festival nights, though relatively rare compared to the ordinary rhythm of curfew and quiet labor that dominated most of the medieval calendar, mattered precisely because of their rarity, offering brief, treasured intervals when the medieval night belonged, if only for a few hours, everyone. Chapter 14. The Widow's Night, Solitude, and Survival. Widowhood was an exceptionally common experience for medieval women, given the frequency of early death from illness, childbirth complications affecting husbands, subsequent remarriages, warfare, and the simple demographic reality of an unpredictable lifespan. For a widow, particularly one without adult sons or other male relatives living nearby, the structure of night itself changed fundamentally. The tasks of securing the household, managing finances, and responding to any emergency that arose after dark, responsibilities that might otherwise have been shared with or deferred to a husband, now fell entirely to her alone. Widows occupied a distinctive and somewhat paradoxical legal position in medieval society. In many regions, a widow retained greater control over property and could conduct business in her own name to a degree that married women, whose legal identity was largely absorbed into their husbands under common law traditions, generally could not. This meant that a widow running her own household, trade, or small business had to personally manage every aspect of that enterprise, including its nighttime security and operation, without the shared authority a marriage would ordinarily have provided. Surviving wills and probate inventories offer glimpses into how widows organized their households for this reality, sometimes explicitly providing for a servant or companion to share the home specifically for reasons of security and companionship through the night. Other widows, lacking the resources for such arrangements, managed entirely alone, a circumstance reflected in the particular vulnerability to accusation, suspicion, or crime that surviving court records suggest such women sometimes faced, precisely because their solitary nighttime existence marked them as somewhat outside the ordinary, male-headed household structure that medieval society generally assumed. Yet this same solitude also brought a measure of genuine independence and unavailable to most other women. A widow answered, in the practical matters of her nightly household governance, to no husband. She decided when to bank the fire, whether to admit a late visitor, how to respond to a disturbance outside her door, and how to allocate her evening hours among labor, prayer, correspondence, or rest. For widows engaged in trade, whether continuing a late husband's business or pursuing their own, the evening hours often became dedicated time for account keeping and business planning, tasks that a busier daytime schedule of direct trading or production did not easily accommodate. The image of the medieval widow alone by her fire at night then captures something genuinely central to this experience. Both its real hardship, the loss of shared responsibility and protection that marriage had provided, and its equally real, if more quietly documented, autonomy, in the surviving record of women who successfully managed households, businesses, and even substantial estates as widows. We find some of the clearest evidence of medieval women exercising sustained, independent authority that in many cases was most fully and consistently exercised during exactly those private evening hours when no husband remained to share or to claim the decisions being made. Chapter 15 Stories. By 15 Stories born by for folklore and oral tradition. Long before stories were written down, they were told, and the medieval evening gathered around a hearth with the day's labor finally finished, provided one of the most important settings for this oral tradition. Though often historically under-acknowledged, role as keepers and transmitters of this storytelling tradition, passing tales, proverbs, songs, and practical wisdom from one generation to the next during exactly these quiet evening hours. Grandmothers and older women within a household frequently held particular authority as storytellers, drawing on decades of accumulated tales to entertain children, pass down family history, and transmit the kind of practical folk wisdom, weather signs, planting advice, remedies for common ailments, that supplemented and sometimes ran alongside more formal, male-dominated bodies of written knowledge. This oral tradition, precisely because it was spoken rather than written, has left far less direct trace in the surviving historical record than the literate culture of monasteries and noble households. Yet its existence is confirmed repeatedly through indirect evidence, references in sermons, warning against superstitious old wives' tales, mentions in later folklore collections of stories explicitly attributed to elderly female tellers, and the persistent cross-cultural pattern of associating storytelling with exactly this kind of domestic evening gathering. The stories told during these evening hours ranged widely in character, from cautionary tales meant to instill particular moral lessons in children, to romantic and adventurous tales echoing, in simplified form, the chivalric literature more commonly associated with noble courts. Local landscape features or unusual customs rooted in half-remembered history or pure invention. Ghost stories and tales of supernatural encounters held particular prominence in evening storytelling, a fitting subject given the setting itself, told by flickering firelight in a darkened room where the boundary between the ordinary world and something stranger might, for the length of a story, feel genuinely thin. This storytelling tradition also served a more practical social function, reinforcing community values, transmitting local history, and helping children absorb the accumulated practical knowledge of their community in a form far more memorable than a tale warning of the dangers awaiting a child who wandered too far from home after dark. For instance, taught exactly the kind of caution that medieval parents, acutely aware of the genuine dangers described earlier in this account, wish their children to internalize. In noble households, this domestic oral tradition existed alongside, and sometimes fed into, more formal literary culture, with elements of folk tale and popular story finding their way, transformed and elaborated, into the written romances and chronicles produced by court and clerks. The evening fireside, then, functioned as something like a hidden workshop of medieval culture, a space where women's voices, rarely recorded directly in the official record of the period, nonetheless shaped the stories, values, and imagination passed down through generations, one quiet evening at a time. Conclusion: what but the Naigit remembers. Across these 15 chapters, a picture has emerged that the official daylight record of medieval history rarely captures directly. When the curfew bell rang and the town gates swung shut, women's lives did not simply pause until morning. They continued, transformed by darkness into something distinct from the daylight roles that dominate most surviving accounts of the period. The spinner became, in the evening hours, an independent earner, the midwife became, for a few urgent hours, the most powerful figure in a household, facing the crisis of birth. The nun became a voice raised in solitary devotion while the rest of the world slept. The widow became the sole, unaided, governor of her own small domain. None of this happened in defiance of medieval society, so much as within the gaps that society's own structures inevitably left open. Curfew laws could regulate the streets, but they could not stop labor pains from beginning at midnight, could not prevent bread dough from needing to rise overnight, and could not fully suppress the simple human desire for a private word with someone a family had forbidden. The medieval night, then, functioned as a kind of pressure valve within a rigidly structured daylight world. A space where necessity, devotion, and quiet personal agency found room to operate that the daytime hours, with all their public scrutiny, rarely allowed. This is not to romanticize what was, for many women, a life of genuine hardship and real danger. The same darkness that offered privacy also concealed violence. The same independence that a widow exercised by her fire at night was born, more often than not, from painful loss rather than free choice. The same knowledge that made a wise woman valuable could, under the wrong circumstances, place her in real danger. The medieval night held both possibility and peril in close, inseparable proximity, and any honest account of the period must hold both truths together. What survives to tell us this story comes to us in fragments. A court roll noting a fine for curfew violation, a household account recording payment for nighttime nursing, a convent customary describing the bell that woke nuns for matins, a coroner's report noting a woman's accidental death by her own hearth fire late in the evening. None of these documents was created to tell the story of women's nights. Each captures only the passing, incidental trace of a life that was, in its own time, simply ordinary, unremarkable, not thought worth recording in any deliberate way. And yet, pieced together, these fragments restore something essential to our understanding of the medieval world. An awareness that half of every day, the half after the sun went down, was shaped as thoroughly by women's labor, faith, fear, and quiet endurance as the half before it. The bells that closed the gates each evening did not close the story. They simply marked the moment when it moved into the shadows, where it continued, hour, candle by candle, until the sky lightened once more and the world of daylight record resumed its watch. The women who lived through those hidden hours left little behind in the way of names or dates. What they left, instead, is the quiet, persistent evidence that the night, too, was theirs. Thank you for watching my story. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment.